How does President Trump's impeachment defense compare to President Clinton's and President Nixon's? This is the Washington Week Extra. Good evening. As we discussed on the program, the impeachment proceedings against President Trump entered a new phase this week after a historic House vote. Joining us to continue this conversation, Nancy Cordes, Chief Congressional Correspondent for CBS News, Vivian Salama, White House reporter for The Wall Street Journal, Jake Sherman, senior writer for Politico and co-author of Playbook, and Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for The New York Times and co-author of Impeachment in American History. As the co-author of Impeachment in American History and the writer of The Breach, which was published in 2000.
The Johnson impeachment. I'm just going to say that up front.
Peter, we know you didn't cover Johnson. I mean, the ageless Peter Baker here. But you did cover President Clinton.
I did, yeah.
When you look back at that in particular, what stands out about President Trump's impeachment process right now that stands in contrast to what you saw and covered then?
Well, a couple of things are similar, a couple of things are different. First of all, let's just say up front that the allegations are very different, right? And we shouldn't make a comparison. One was accused of lying under oath and obstruction of justice in a sexual harassment lawsuit. And the other is talking about abuse of power to convince a foreign government to help his domestic political situation. Very different. Other than that, though, you hear echoes, right? And everybody's, is now taking other sides. Back in 20 years ago, it was the Democrats who were complaining about a coup, and they used words like lynching, and they said the process is terrible, and they used the word witch hunt. Today, of course, it's the other side. And likewise, back then, the Republicans were talking about rule of law and how solemn this was, and we do this in sadness, not in any partisan anger. And of course, that's what Nancy Pelosi was saying this week. What's different is 20 years ago, when they launched the impeachment inquiry, 31 Democrats did vote for that. They didn't vote in the final vote, only 5 votes for Democrats for the final impeachment, but the 31 said we have to at least have an inquiry. This week you saw no Republicans say that there should be an inquiry into President Trump. We are hardened even more than we were 20 years ago. Our parties are more divided, more ideological, more polarized than they were even then when we thought it was pretty bad then.
And President Nixon didn't have a conservative media ecosystem to back him up on impeachment. So how does this White House see the whole Republican Party and also just the conservative side of politics in America as a protection of sorts, perhaps, as they face all of these challenges?
It's been an interesting time for the White House as far as thinking that the Republican and conservative media is on their side here, because there have been moments where even Fox News and some of the other more conservative news organizations have been a little bit concerned and, pointing out some of the issues. When the transcript came out, a lot of them raising concern about the fact that the president asked the president of another country to get involved in the elections. And so this has been an issue. Obviously, the president still has his allies within the media, but for the most part, this has been something where he's even gone after Fox News and criticized them because he doesn't feel like they're backing him enough. And so obviously technology has changed since the Nixon era as well. So we have Twitter now that the president can kind of go out and defend himself. But it's been shifting for sure.
Nancy?
One thing I think is interesting is that people look back and say, Bill Clinton was impeached. They don't look back and say, but it was mostly Republicans. If you're impeached, you're impeached. And I think it's the same thing here. If President Trump is impeached, it looks right now like it will be a partisan affair. But when viewed in hindsight, people won't say, oh, but I recall that, that this was all Democrats who did this. What people will say is he'll have that asterisk next to his name, and it'll say he was impeached.
The one difference, though, is that both Clinton and Nixon were second-term presidents. Neither one of them had another election ahead. Mm-hmm. So if President Trump is impeached with the asterisk, you're right, in history, of course, and he's acquitted, which people think he would be at the moment in the Senate, absent a big change in information, then he goes to the electorate, and that's the real judgment. Right? In this case, there's an appeals court after the trial, and the appeals court of the American public, do they think the impeachment was a justified action, or do they think the President of the United States is fit for office? That's going to be the ultimate judgment.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, and the White House tends to believe, and it's tough to put much stock in it because they were so wrong about so many things in the midterm elections and misjudged so much. They believe that this helps the president, riles up the base, much as the Judge Kavanaugh episode did, and we don't know that. We don't know that for sure. But it brings me back to something President Trump told me right after the election, in an interview for my book about Congress. He said, Now Democrats control it. It'll be much easier to work with Democrats. Republicans were too nitpicky. They wanted too many changes with legislation. And now, here we are with the Democratic majority just, digging in their heels and revving their engines, two mixed metaphors there, but, just rearing at the opportunity to impeach him.
What happened to gun control, the USMCA, the new trade deal? Is that all stalled amid impeachment?
I think a lot of it was stalled before impeachment as well. Not necessarily, linked to this issue, but it certainly does not help the matter with Congress engaged now in the impeachment proceedings. It's definitely going to make it a lot harder for the president to try to get any of his trade deals through. Of course, China just hit a bump in the road because the place where he was supposed to sign the agreement with China was in Chile, and that conference was canceled over protests. So that one is a totally different issue. But definitely for the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada deal, it remains to be seen. The administration continues to express optimism that they'll get it at some point, but when? Maybe next year? It's hard to say at this point.
I also think, let's say that this impeachment does come in December, a trial, and he's acquitted in January. That's still 10 months before the election, and so much could happen between now and then. There are multiple court cases that are still working their way through the system, other kinds of information that Democrats are trying to get their hands on, his financial records, his tax records, and on and on. So even after this impeachment fight ends, there could be other investigations.
Maybe they can impeach him again.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to say.
They can't impeach him again. I think it is a one-time thing, but they can still trumpet investigations. They can still hold public hearings. It's certainly not going to be over for him.
Does the
at
Constitution
any
have
point.
a rule about impeachment?
That's a good question.
I
was gonna say,
believe you're
is it
not allowed to impeach
a second time on different
squared.
charges.
Yeah, no, I
Well, I
don't.
mean, you
Double
really,
check.
We have some constitutional lawyers
Politically,
watching.
obviously.
Send us some notes at
They're-
Washington Week's
they'll be
website.
tweeting
Yes.
us.
but think about it. Politically, you really only have one.
As a matter of politics.
Yeah, as a matter of politics, you can't really impeach him again. And
Yeah.
but that is something Democrats I know are thinking about, because what do they do for the next 10 months? Just like you said, Nancy, like if other stuff comes out, they're just going to be. Their hands are going to be tied, and
Right.
they're going to, impeachment is kind of the ultimate remedy or the ultimate check on a president's misbehavior or allegations of misbehavior. So it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Speaking of Democrats, then we're going to be going into the primaries if this stretches into the new year, and you're going to have Democratic candidates now trying to get their messages out and distinguish themselves from their competitors. All the while, everyone's wanting to talk about impeachment, and the president is going to be lobbing verbal grenades at them all the while. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to stay focused on the issues that they want to stay focused on.
But maybe that's not bad for them because, in fact, it keeps the competition between them from getting so over the top and so highlighted in the media and in the political ecosphere that they can have their competition.
They've
without
been under
tearing
the
each other
radar
down,
for months
right?
now.
Right, and they're not tearing each other down.
Always
in
a
way.
second-tier story because
Exactly.
of
If it was a
what's happening
first-tier
with
story,
Washington.
somebody would be emerging much more
As long as
bruised.
they could get their different messages out. Otherwise, how do you know who to choose?
Individually, it would be a problem,
Right,
but maybe
right.
collectively, whoever
Sure,
emerges
yeah.
will be less damaged.
Right.
That's it for this edition of the Washington Week Extra. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts or watch on the Washington Week website. While you're online, check out our Washington Weekly News Quiz. I'm Robert Costa. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.